What would you do if your wife laughed while her boss said you didn't deserve her? Then her coworker asked her out in front of everyone, and she treated it like an easy choice, while you quietly started collecting tiny truths that could ruin them? My name is Grant Hale, and I learned the hard way that humiliation does not always arrive with shouting, because sometimes it arrives with laughter that belongs to your wife while it is aimed at you. It was the kind of lunch hour that pretends to be casual, the kind where people stand in loose circles with paper cups and reheated confidence, and I was there because refusing would have looked like weakness, which is how offices decide what you are allowed to keep. Lila stood half a step ahead of me, the way she always did when she felt important, her posture bright and effortless, her smile ready for any camera that might exist in someone's mind, and I watched the room watch her like she was a prize being passed around without anyone touching. Everett Dale, her boss, had that practiced charm that makes mediocre men feel like leaders, and he was performing in the middle of the common area like the floor belonged to him, because in a way, it did. He leaned into the moment with the ease of someone who had never been told no, and he made the joke that people laugh at, because it is safer than noticing how cruel it is, the one about how I did not deserve her. The circle reacted the way it always does, a ripple of laughter and raised eyebrows, and I felt my face stay still while my stomach tightened like it was bracing for impact. I could have laughed too, I suppose, because laughter is the office's favorite duct tape, but I watched Lila instead, because the room's laugh did not matter as much as hers did. Lila laughed quickly, cleanly, like she had been waiting for a line that gave her permission to enjoy the attention without any guilt attached. And that laugh was the first real sound of the day to me, because it carried a message she would never admit. It said the joke felt true enough to be funny, and it said she liked the power of watching me absorb it, and it said she liked the boss for saying it out loud. I have always believed that people reveal themselves by what they reward, and she rewarded Everett with that bright, approving laugh that made him look bolder than he was. The circle leaned closer, as if we were all sharing a secret, and I stood there with my cup in my hand, feeling how easy it would be to become the office's designated punchline if I let them write the story for me. I did not glare, I did not interrupt, and I did not try to rescue my pride with a performance, because I have seen what happens to men who flail in public, and I have never been interested in giving my enemies free footage. Then Adrian Knox stepped in, and the temperature shifted the way it does when someone attractive decides to make a room about him. Adrian was the kind of coworker who looked like he had been assembled by committee to test people's boundaries, all clean lines and careful grooming, with eyes that practiced their smile before they delivered it. He had the confidence of a man who believed the social rules were optional if you were charming enough, and he carried himself like he was already forgiven for whatever he was about to do. He did not look at me first, which was deliberate, because he wanted the power of pretending I was not a factor, and he addressed Lila with that casual admiration that sounds like a compliment while it is actually a claim. He built on Everett's joke like it was a platform, and he offered his agreement the way men offer currency, and then he turned it into a suggestion that was not really a suggestion at all, because the point was to make it public enough that backing out would cost her something. A date, he implied, simple, playful, nothing serious, the kind of thing that becomes serious only after the damage is done, and the circle leaned in again because humiliation is a group sport. People assume moments like that are about confrontation, about whether the husband will puff up and defend his territory, but the truth is that the husband's first job is to watch. I watched how Lila reacted before she had time to edit herself, and I saw her eyes flick toward the faces around us because she was measuring what they wanted from her. I saw the micro pause that meant she understood the risk and liked it anyway, and I saw her smile widen in a way that did not include me. She did not say yes with words, not in a way anyone could quote later, but her body said yes with the ease of her laughter and the way she did not shut it down, and her silence said yes because she let Adrian keep standing there like he belonged next to her. Everett chuckled like he had just facilitated a cute little scene, and the circle responded with a kind of approval that felt like permission. In that moment, I understood the shape of what was happening, because my wife was being offered a public upgrade, and she was enjoying the fact that the offer was being made over my head. I have never believed in shouting matches, not because I am above them, but because shouting matches are gifts you hand to people who want to paint you as unstable. My work trains me to think in patterns and consequences, not in catharsis, and I have always found that the loudest person in a room is usually the one with the weakest case. So I did not explode, and I did not make threats, and I did not beg her to respect me in front of people who had already decided I was the background character in her story. I held my expression steady and let my sarcasm stay inside, because I wanted to see how far they would go if I did not interrupt the theater. Adrian's eyes finally touched mine, just a quick look to confirm I was watching, and there was a flash of satisfaction there, because men like him do not seduce only for desire, they seduce for victory. Lila adjusted a strand of hair and laughed again, softer this time, and that laugh landed like a stamp on a document, because it told the room she was not offended, and it told Adrian he could keep pushing, and it told Everett his joke had been a success. After that, the rest of lunch blurred into small talk and harmless topics, because that is how people behave when they have just watched something ugly and they want to pretend it was normal. Someone made a comment about quarterly numbers, someone else asked about weekend plans, and the circle reshaped itself so nobody had to look me in the eyes for too long. I remember the smell of burnt coffee and the stale sweetness of store-bought pastries, because sensory details have a way of attaching themselves to betrayal, as if your brain wants a physical anchor for the moment your life changed. I remember the elevator chime in the distance, the soft squeak of someone shifting in a folding chair, and the faint toner smell drifting from a printer nearby, because offices are factories for paper trails, and I had a feeling I was about to build one. Lila touched my arm once, lightly, the way you touch furniture when you pass it, and she did it with a smile that said, "We were fine," which meant she wanted the room to believe we were fine. That touch was not affection, it was optics, and that is when I stopped thinking of this as a marriage problem and started thinking of it as an exposure problem. On the drive home, I let the silence do its work, because silence makes people talk, and people talking is where the cracks appear. Lila tried to smooth the day into a joke, framing it as teasing, framing Adrian as harmless, framing Everett as socially awkward but well-meaning, and framing me as the man who could not take a compliment aimed at his wife. She talked quickly, the way she always did when she wanted to outrun the truth, and she kept circling back to how everyone likes her, like that was evidence of innocence. I nodded at the right places and kept my eyes on the road, because I did not want to argue about the meaning of what happened, not yet, not when the real question was what she planned to do next. She asked if I was okay, but her tone made it clear she wanted me to say yes so she could move on, and I told her I was fine because I was, in a way that frightened me. There is a point where anger stops being heat and becomes clarity, and clarity does not shout, it starts taking notes. At home, she moved through our kitchen with that effortless confidence again, opening drawers, filling a glass, tapping her phone face down on the counter like it was a private promise. I watched the phone the way you watch a locked door, not because I wanted to break in, but because I wanted to see who came knocking. I did not reach for it, and I did not try to guess passwords, because I do not need illegal access to ruin someone. I only need them to keep lying while the world keeps leaving footprints. She mentioned she might be working late this week, and she said it like an afterthought, like the office simply demanded her presence, but her eyes flicked away when she said it, and I felt the first real tug of the thread. I asked what project, and she answered with a vague description that had no edges, no names, no deliverables, the kind of story you tell when you want it to be hard to verify. She tried to kiss me after, a quick normalizing gesture, and I let it happen without responding the way she expected, because I wanted her to feel the subtle shift without being able to accuse me of anything. That night, I lay awake longer than I admitted, listening to the small house sounds that used to comfort me and now felt like an interrogation room. I kept returning to the public nature of that moment, because it mattered that the offer was made in front of witnesses, and it mattered that she laughed, and it mattered that her boss started it, because that meant this was not simply a private temptation. This was a social permission structure, a scaffolding built from jokes and smiles and shared complicity, and I could feel how quickly it could become the accepted story that my wife was too good for me, with Adrian positioned as the natural replacement and Everett positioned as the benevolent kingmaker. If I fought it emotionally, I would become the jealous husband who could not handle her success, and if I ignored it, I would become the man who accepted disrespect as his role. There was only one method that did not feed their narrative, and it was the method I had used my whole life without calling it anything. Death by 1,000 truths, each one lawful, each one small, each one undeniable when placed in the right light. I made a simple decision before the sun came up, and it was not the kind of decision that feels dramatic because it felt more like paperwork. I would not accuse her in private, and I would not beg for reassurance, and I would not chase Adrian around like he mattered more than my wife's choices. I would build a ledger, and I would keep it clean, and I would let time do what time always does to liars, which is force them to add details until the details contradict each other. I would use only what touched my life naturally: household-level proof, public posts, shared schedules, receipts tied to my accounts, and the kind of accidental glimpses that happen when you live with someone who thinks she is smarter than consequences. I would keep my face calm and my questions rare, because the fewer questions you ask, the less room they have to rehearse answers. I would let them believe I was stunned or meek or slow, because underestimating me would be the easiest choice they made, and it would be the last choice that felt easy. The first crack arrived the next day as a light vibration on my phone, a notification that was not addressed to me but still touched my world, and as I stared at the screen, I felt the cold glass against my thumb like a promise I could not unmake. I did not smile, and I did not panic, and I did not tell myself stories about misunderstandings because I had already seen what her laughter meant, and now I was holding the first tiny truth that could grow teeth. The notification was the kind that pretends it does not matter, a small preview that exists for half a second and then acts innocent, but my nervous system treated it like an alarm. I did not open anything I was not allowed to open, and I did not do anything heroic or illegal because I have never needed spy gear to understand human nature, and I have never trusted a marriage that requires surveillance to survive. I simply noted the time, because time is the one witness that never gets sentimental, and I watched how quickly Lila reacted when her phone lit up a second later on the kitchen counter. She was washing a mug, moving like she had all day to be a person who never makes mistakes, and then her shoulders tightened in that tiny involuntary way that people do when they feel exposed. She did not look at me, which was the point, and she moved the phone closer to herself, with the smoothness of someone who wants it to look natural, which is always how guilt behaves when it thinks it is clever. I let that moment pass without comment, because comments are invitations, and I was done inviting her to practice lying on me. I poured coffee, listened to the kettle hiss, and watched the steam fog the window above the sink, because there is something obscene about ordinary domestic peace when it is sitting on top of rot. She asked if I wanted anything from the store later, and she asked it with the tone of a woman who believes small errands can erase big disrespect, and I answered like it was a normal day because I needed her to believe the surface was still holding. Under the surface, I was building a ledger in my head, and the ledger had one rule that mattered more than all the others. I only write down what I can prove. Suspicion is cheap, emotion is expensive, and proof is the only currency that spends well in public. At work, the aftertaste of that lunch hour scene still hung in the air because offices do not forget humiliation. They recycle it. I could feel the glances in the hallway, the little pauses in conversation when I walked past, the way people tried not to look curious while they were being curious anyway. There is a special kind of cruelty in professional spaces, because nobody wants blood on their hands, so they use smiles instead, and they call it culture. I kept my face neutral and my pace steady, and I did not go hunting for Adrian, because hunting makes you look desperate, and desperate men become convenient villains. The funny thing about being publicly diminished is that it clarifies who enjoys it, and I started noticing who greeted me like a person and who greeted me like an obstacle. Lila's desk was on another floor, which meant the building itself provided distance. And distance is where secrets like to grow. I did not stare at her calendar, and I did not ask her coworkers questions, because I was not interested in turning my private life into a workplace rumor in a way that would benefit her. Instead, I watched the few things that naturally overlapped our lives, the shared routines we could not avoid, the small logistical knots that marriages tie, and the little conveniences that become liabilities when one person starts living a second story. We had shared albums for family photos, the kind couples create because they believe the future will want evidence of happiness, and those albums were visible to both of us because we had set them up together in a better season. I did not need passwords for those, and I did not need to break anything because I already had lawful access to what we had jointly chosen to share. That evening, after she went upstairs to change clothes, I opened the shared album on my own device, not her phone, not her account, and I scrolled slowly, letting my brain do what it does best, which is compare patterns. The photos were mostly ordinary, small holidays, dinners with friends, a few awkward selfies, a couple of pictures of the living room that she took when she was proud of a new throw pillow, as if fabric could fix a life. Then I saw a memory prompt pop up, the platform's cheerful reminder that time is passing, and the thumbnail looked harmless enough. A blurred slice of a room with warm lighting and a glass on a table. If I had been the kind of man who wanted to believe, I would have dismissed it as nothing. But I was no longer that man, and I tapped it with the calm of someone opening a file, not a wound. The image itself was not a confession, because adultery rarely announces itself in full, and most betrayal hides inside plausible scenes. The clue was the metadata, the date, and the location tag that appeared beneath it like a quiet verdict. The place was not our home, and it was not her office, and it was not one of the approved stops in her daily story, and the timestamp sat on an evening when she had told me she was running late for a work deadline. There are only so many lies a person can tell before the calendar becomes their enemy, and that's when the sarcasm in me woke up. Not in a funny way, but in the way a man smiles when he realizes he has been underestimated. I did not screenshot out of panic, and I did not send it to anyone like a teenager trying to start a fire, because fires burn evidence too. I saved the screen on my phone, quietly, and I made sure the date was visible, because dates are the bones of accountability. When Lila came back downstairs, she was dressed for an evening that was supposedly routine, but her routine had started looking like a costume. She stood near the doorway adjusting an earring, her face bright, her energy sharpened, and she asked if I wanted to join her for a quick dinner later, as if she were offering a consolation prize. I told her I had work to finish, which was true, and the truth tasted strange in my mouth because I had started rationing it. She said she would be late, and she gave me the cover story again, the same vague mention of a project, the same soft complaint about deadlines, and I watched her eyes for the micro-movements that betray a rehearsal. She delivered it smoothly, but her phrasing had the sameness of something repeated, and I remembered how she had laughed at Everett's joke like a woman accepting a script. The pattern was not just the affair, it was the performance, and performance always has seams if you are patient enough to look. After she left, the house felt larger, and the quiet felt like a room where I could finally breathe without being managed. I sat at the kitchen table and took out a legal pad, not because I wanted to feel dramatic, but because paper has a way of making you honest with yourself. I wrote the date of the lunch scene. Then I wrote what happened in simple language, because fancy words are what liars use to soften reality. I wrote the time of the notification, and I wrote the date and location from the album metadata, and I kept the lines clean, each fact separated from my feelings like a bullet from a bruise. It was not a love story anymore. It was a sequence of events, and sequences can be proven. I did not write that she did not love me, because that is a theory, and I did not write that she wanted Adrian, because desire is slippery, but I wrote that she laughed when her boss said I did not deserve her, and I wrote that she did not shut down Adrian when he pushed for a date, and I wrote that her shared album showed a location tag that contradicted her stated whereabouts. It would have been easy to confront her right then, to send her the screenshot and demand an explanation, but easy choices are usually the ones that keep you in the same loop. Confrontation gives them the chance to craft a story around your anger, and if she had learned anything from her boss and her coworker, it was how to turn a room's attention into a shield. I wanted her to keep talking, keep adding details, keep stepping deeper into the trap of her own timeline, because I knew something about people like Lila and Adrian and Everett. They only feel safe when they think they control the narrative. The moment you reveal you have proof, they stop improvising and they start coordinating, and coordination makes lies harder to separate. So I stayed quiet, and I let the proof sit like a loaded sentence I had not spoken yet. Later that night, she came home with a brightness that did not belong to late work, and she carried it like perfume. She slipped off her shoes near the entryway, moved through the living room, and talked about her day with the confident boredom of someone who believes the details are too dull for anyone to question. She mentioned a colleague, she complained about a meeting, she tossed in a few specific words like landmarks, because specific words make lies feel real. And I listened like a man watching someone build a tower on sand. She asked about my day, and I gave her enough truth to look normal, because normal is the camouflage that keeps the hunt ethical. When she leaned in to kiss me, I let my cheek accept it, and I hated how quickly she accepted that small distance, as if intimacy was another tool she could adjust when convenient. In bed, she fell asleep faster than I did, and her breathing was steady, the kind of steady that suggests peace. And I lay there, staring into the dark, thinking about the office circle's laughter. I thought about Adrian's eyes, the quick satisfaction of a man who believes the husband is powerless, and I thought about Everett's role in it, because bosses do not make jokes like that by accident. Everett had set the stage, Adrian had stepped into the spotlight, and my wife had rewarded them both, which meant this was not just about attraction, it was about status, and status is always enforced publicly. That was the part that sharpened my focus, because if they were building their confidence in public, then public was where they would eventually fail, and my job was to make sure the failure looked like consequence, not revenge. The next morning, I checked the shared album again, not obsessively, not like a man spiraling, but like a man verifying a measurement. The platform offered another memory, another cheerful prompt, and I felt the dry humor of it, because technology has no shame, it just stores. I saved another screen that showed the date, and I kept it in the same folder as the first, because organization is what separates a story from a case. Then I went to work and acted like a man whose wife had not laughed at his humiliation, because the hardest part of revenge is not anger, it is patience, and patience looks like calm. In the elevator, I watched my reflection in the stainless steel, and I realized my face had changed, not into rage, but into something sharper, something quieter, something that could wait. Around midday, my phone buzzed again with another small preview, and this time the timing lined up with a gap in her story that she had not noticed yet, and I felt the ledger in my mind click into place like a latch. I did not know exactly how I would bring it into the light, and I did not know yet how far HR would go to protect the people who made the building feel powerful. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. The first part of their downfall would not be me shouting, it would be them talking, and the second part would be me letting the right room see the facts at the right moment, when backing away would cost them more than lying. The third notification arrived like a polite knock from the universe, the kind that pretends it is routine while it quietly changes the direction of your week, and I felt my mind shift into a colder gear that did not need comfort or permission. I was at my desk pretending to care about a spreadsheet that suddenly looked like a child's drawing, and my phone vibrated with the kind of merchant alert that only shows up when a purchase touches an account I own, an account that was supposed to serve a household, not someone's secret applause addiction. I did not need to guess what it meant or build a fantasy around it, because numbers do not flirt and timestamps do not gaslight, and the alert gave me exactly what I needed, which was a merchant name, a date, an amount, and a time that did not fit the version of reality Lila had been selling me. I stared at it for a second longer than I should have, not because I was stunned, but because I was measuring how much damage could hide inside one small line of text, and I saved the screenshot with the calm precision of someone bagging evidence in his own life. Then I did something that felt almost funny in its restraint, because I simply put the phone face down and kept working, as if my marriage had not just handed me a clean piece of proof on a silver tray. In a building full of people who performed confidence for a living, my quiet focus was the most dangerous thing I could offer, because it gave nobody a story to weaponize against me. All afternoon, I watched the clock like a man watching a jury deliberate, because I already knew what I was going to do, and my only job was to do it without making it messy. I would not confront Lila with the alert, because confrontation would only teach her which parts of the timeline to patch. And I would not ask Adrian anything, because men like him do not answer, they spin. Instead, I would follow the lawful path that any normal account holder follows when he sees a charge that does not make sense, which is request the receipt and let the merchant's own system speak. There is an irony in that, because the same corporate world that teaches people to lie with confidence also forces them to log everything, and those logs become the rope they trip over when they get arrogant. I left work at a normal time, drove to the location named in the alert, and sat in the car for a moment before going inside, not to psych myself up, but to remind myself of the rules I had set. No drama, no threats, no raised voice, no private detective fantasies, and no violations of anyone's privacy, because the truth would land harder if it arrived wearing a clean collar. I walked into the place like a customer, because I was a customer, and I asked for a duplicate receipt for a transaction on my card, because it was my card, and the request was so ordinary that it felt almost obscene against the reality of why I was there. The cashier did what cashiers do, which is treat your personal life like it is none of their business while their screen quietly tells them everything, and within minutes I had a printed receipt copy in my hand with the time stamped plainly, the kind of plainness that makes lies look theatrical. I did not ask questions that would invite gossip, and I did not say anything about my wife or her coworker because I did not need a stranger's pity, and I did not want any human interpretation contaminating the proof. I simply folded the receipt and slid it into my jacket pocket like it was a routine errand. Then I walked out and sat back in my car, holding the paper the way you hold a verdict you are not ready to read out loud. The details were enough to be useful, because the merchant name matched the alert, the time was clean, and the location was one she had never mentioned in any late work explanation, and that was the point where my sarcasm returned, not as humor, but as a protective layer. Lila had been acting like I was a dull man who would accept any story if it was delivered with a smile, and Adrian had been acting like I was a shadow you could step over, and Everett had been acting like he had the authority to assign value to my marriage in public. Meanwhile, their real enemy was not me, it was documentation, because documentation does not care how beautiful someone is or how important their boss thinks they are. At home, I did not spread the proof on the table like a scene from a bad television show, because the whole point of my method was patience, and patience looks boring on purpose. I put the receipt in a folder, I printed the merchant alert screenshot and signed the back with the date, and I stapled the printout behind the receipt so the chain was obvious even to a tired stranger. Then I opened my legal pad and added a new line to the ledger, keeping the language simple and the tone neutral, because my feelings were not admissible and my pride was not a source. When you write things down this way, you stop being a man trying to win an argument and you become a man building a timeline, and timelines have a way of turning charming people into cornered people. I looked at the earlier entries, the lunch hour humiliation, the shared cloud memory metadata, the time I had noted from that first suspicious notification, and now the merchant alert and receipt, and I felt the case structure start to form. It still was not enough for an accusation that would survive public scrutiny, because a receipt alone can be explained away, and a photo metadata line alone can be dismissed as misremembered context. But together, they started to build a spine, and spines hold weight. I could already predict how she would respond if I confronted her now, because she would either claim a misunderstanding, or she would claim a work-related reason, or she would flip the table and accuse me of distrusting her, and any of those paths would still leave her in control of the room's emotional temperature. I was not going to let her control the temperature anymore, because heat favors liars and cold favors facts. When Lila came home that evening, she did not look like a woman who had been grinding through work under fluorescent lights, and she did not smell like a woman who had been trapped in an office with stale air, and that contrast was so obvious that it almost made me laugh. Almost. She moved through the doorway with the kind of lightness that people carry when they have been validated, and she talked in a slightly higher pitch than usual, the pitch she used when she wanted to seem harmless. She offered me a version of her day that sounded rehearsed, and it included just enough specificity to feel real while still avoiding anything I could check easily, and that was my first confirmation that she had no idea what had just landed in my folder. She mentioned a meeting that ran late, she mentioned a task that blew up at the last minute, and she mentioned Adrian's name in passing as if he were irrelevant, which is always what people do when someone is not irrelevant at all. I listened without interrupting, and I gave her the polite nods that kept the surface smooth, because smooth surfaces make people careless. She asked if I was quiet because of the lunch joke, and she framed it as my sensitivity again, which was her way of telling me she would rather diagnose my reaction than examine her behavior, and I shrugged as if it did not matter, because I wanted her to keep underestimating me. Later, while she showered, I opened the shared cloud album again, not because I was addicted to checking, but because the merchant receipt had given me a location, and locations create search targets. The platform's interface offered another bright little memory prompt, and I hated how cheerfully it packaged the past. But I tapped through with calm intent and found what I needed, which was a photo that looked meaningless until you studied it. It was a close shot of a glass, a table edge, a warm light source, nothing scandalous, but the background had a reflection that suggested another person nearby, and the metadata timestamp aligned closely with the receipt time. I saved the metadata screen again, making sure the date and location were visible, because I was not collecting proof of cheating in the childish sense. I was collecting proof of lying, and lying is what breaks people publicly. Cheating is emotional, but lying is procedural, and procedural consequences are the only kind that land cleanly without looking like a vendetta. If someone asked me later why I did not just talk to my wife, I would have an answer that did not need drama, because talking only works when the other person respects the truth, and Lila had already laughed when truth was mocked in front of witnesses. The next day at work, I felt the aftershock of my own restraint, because restraint changes how people interact with you, and I started noticing the subtle shifts. A colleague in the hallway held eye contact a fraction longer than usual, like she was measuring whether I was still the same man from last week. Someone in a group chat made a joke about upgrades and then deleted it too late, because deletion does not erase the moment you chose to be cruel. Adrian passed me near the elevator and gave me a smile that was meant to look friendly, but it carried the faint arrogance of a man who believed the story was already written, and I returned a neutral nod that gave him nothing to feed on. Everett, for his part, acted like the lunch joke had been harmless bonding, and he made a point of addressing me in a public space with extra warmth, which is what managers do when they sense risk and want to pre-frame it as misunderstanding. I watched him carefully because men like Everett do not joke about husbands unless they believe they have leverage, and leverage always leaves a footprint somewhere, usually in process, usually in HR, usually in the places where narratives are turned into records. That afternoon, I did not chase gossip, but gossip chased me anyway, because it always does when people think they witnessed the beginning of a story. A coworker I barely knew offered a sympathy smile without saying why, and I stored that detail as another sign that the room was already being coached to interpret events a certain way. Lila's performance had not started at home, it had started in public, and I could feel the social scaffolding being built around her, the kind that says she is desirable and I am lucky, which is the polite modern way of saying I should accept disrespect. I went back to my desk and opened the folder on my phone, looked at the merchant alert screenshot, the receipt copy, and the cloud metadata screens, and I felt something settle in me that was not peace, but was close to certainty. I was no longer guessing whether she was lying because I had the first clean mismatch between her stated timeline and her documented movements, and that mismatch was a lever I could pull later without raising my voice. That night, I began building the simplest possible table on paper, because simplicity is what survives scrutiny. Date, time, place, source of proof, and the version of her story that applied, written in her own language as closely as I could remember it. I kept the lines short, the entries clean, and I used a marker to highlight one line per proof, because when you put facts in a row like that, you take away the only weapon liars have, which is confusion. I did not feel triumph, because triumph would have made this childish, and I was not doing this to feel big, I was doing this to stop being treated small. I was building a record, and records have a way of migrating into rooms you did not expect, especially when the antagonists are people who live inside process and policy. I knew the next step would have to involve witnesses again, because this story had begun in public, and it would have to end in public. But I was not ready to choose the arena yet, because I needed one more thing. I needed her to commit to a bigger lie, one that would collide with something documented in a way she could not wiggle out of. When I turned off the light and lay down beside her, I listened to her breathe, and I realized I was not waiting for her to confess anymore. I was waiting for her to slip, because slipping was inevitable when someone believed they were making easy choices. The slip came sooner than I expected, because the next morning she mentioned an upcoming late meeting on a day I knew we had a shared commitment, and she said it casually, like the calendar did not exist, and I felt the ledger in my mind tighten into a straight line. I did not correct her, and I did not remind her, and I did not look at her like a man who had caught something, because catching is not the same as closing. I simply nodded, let her walk out the door with her confidence intact, and I reached for my phone to open our shared calendar, because if she wanted to rewrite time, then time was about to push back. By midweek, I stopped treating Lila's stories like explanations and started treating them like raw material, because every lie is a draft that needs revision, and revisions leave seams. She mentioned a late meeting on a night we had a shared commitment, and she delivered it with that casual confidence people use when they assume the calendar belongs to them. But our calendar did not belong to her alone, and that was the first real leverage point she handed me without realizing it. I did not correct her, and I did not remind her, and I did not argue, because arguing would have given her a reason to tighten her story, and tightening is how liars survive longer than they should. Instead, I nodded like a man who had accepted his role as an inconvenience, and then I waited, because waiting is not passive when you know exactly what you are waiting for. The next morning, I opened the shared calendar on my own device and stared at the weak view the way a patient stares at a scan, looking for the shadow that explains the symptoms. There it was in plain sight, our commitment sitting neatly on the same evening she had just claimed as unavailable, and the overlap was not subtle, not interpretable, not something you could blame on a misunderstanding, because we had confirmed it together days earlier. I exported the weak view as a simple PDF and saved it, not because I needed to feel clever, but because I needed the sequence to exist outside my memory, and memory is where people like Lila like to fight. Then, I printed the page at work, because office printers are reliable, and because paper has weight in a way screens sometimes do not, and I folded it into my folder at home behind the receipt and the merchant alert printout, making the stack feel less like a marriage problem and more like a case file built from household truth. At lunch, the office's mood felt slightly different, like a room that has been told there is smoke somewhere and cannot find the fire. People's jokes were softer around me, their smiles more careful, and I could feel that a narrative was forming about my silence, because silence always gets interpreted, and interpretation is what HR feeds on. Adrian drifted through the common area as if he owned it, and he made a point of being visible near Lila, not touching her, not crossing any line that could be called misconduct outright, but performing proximity the way a salesman performs value. Lila played her role too, smiling in the right places, laughing at the right comments, and keeping her eyes away from mine with the kind of discipline that suggests practice. Everett, her boss, treated the entire building like his stage, and he threw out another joking comment about relationships in the abstract, the kind that lets him test the room's appetite without pinning him to a specific cruelty. And I watched how people laughed again, because laughter is the easiest way to announce loyalty without saying anything at all. I did not confront anyone, because my job was not to win an argument, it was to win reality, and reality takes time to become undeniable. After work, I ran a normal errand that doubled as a quiet check, because normal errands take you through places where other people's memories live. The merchant from the receipt was in a building with a small lobby, and the lobby had the kind of staff who see patterns without meaning to, the kind who recognize couples and routines and who paid for what, not because they are nosy, but because repetition makes faces familiar. I walked in with the same calm I used when I requested the duplicate receipt, and I asked a simple question that did not require anyone to take sides, because sides are where people start lying to protect themselves. I asked whether a man matching Adrian's description had been in earlier that week around the stamped time on the receipt, and I kept my tone neutral, like a person verifying a billing issue, and the response I got was not a confession, not a dramatic revelation, but a single plain sentence that aligned with the pattern. I did not ask for the person's name, and I did not ask them to sign anything, because I was not building a courtroom case, and I was not dragging strangers into my marriage. I simply noted the role of the witness in my mind and wrote one sentence down later at home, on paper, with the date, because a neutral witness line is not about theatrics, it is about triangulation. It is a way to say that I did not invent the pattern in my head, and that I did not need surveillance to find it, because public routines leave public impressions. That was the moment I understood how much safer my method was than emotion, because emotion depends on whether the other person agrees with you, while documentation stands on its own. I wrote the witness line exactly once, keeping it vague enough to protect them, but specific enough to anchor the timeline, and I signed my own name under it, because I wanted the ledger to show I was not hiding behind anonymous claims. A liar's favorite defense is to claim everything is rumor, and I was building something that could not be dismissed as rumor without dismissing the very systems people rely on to function. That night, Lila came home later than usual, and she did not mention the delay until I asked a question so simple it sounded like small talk. She answered quickly, then adjusted the answer a second later, and the adjustment was so slight that she probably thought it was invisible, but it was not invisible to me anymore, because once you start tracking lies, you notice how often they come in pairs. She tried to add a detail about a colleague who needed help, and she named the wrong department, and then she corrected herself, and the correction came with a laugh meant to make it cute. I let her laugh fall into the space between us without responding, because silence makes people feel the need to fill it, and she filled it with more explanation than I asked for. More explanation is always the tell, because innocent people answer what was asked, while guilty people answer what they fear you might ask next. I could have pushed then. I could have asked about the merchant, the receipt, the location tag, the calendar overlap, and I could have watched her scramble. But scrambling would have given her the adrenaline she needed to perform her way out. Instead, I asked one question only, one date only, delivered softly like I was confirming logistics, and I watched her eyes as she answered, because eyes move differently when a person is checking their memory versus checking their script. She answered the date, but her phrasing did not match how she normally spoke about dates, and that mismatch told me she was not remembering, she was selecting. Then she asked why I was asking, and the edge in her voice arrived too quickly, because curiosity that is innocent takes time, while fear arrives instantly. I shrugged again, kept my expression neutral, and let her tell herself that I was confused, because confused husbands are easy to manage, and she still believed management was possible. The next day, she changed her plan about that upcoming evening commitment without acknowledging the calendar at all, and she did it in a way that suggested she had already decided the commitment did not matter. She framed it as unavoidable work pressure. She framed it as her boss needing her. She framed it as career necessity, and she framed me as the person who should be proud of her dedication instead of questioning it. That framing was useful because it gave me a clean cover story to place next to a documented overlap, and contradictions only become dangerous when they are placed side by side. I took the printed calendar sheet at home and marked the overlap with a pen, not dramatically, not like I was underlining betrayal, but like I was correcting a mistake on a form, because to me it was a form now, a record of her choices. I took a photo of the marked overlap next to a clock on the wall, because time anchoring matters, and then I put the paper away again, because I wanted the proof to exist without becoming a performance. At work, the social atmosphere kept shifting in small, petty ways, the kind of ways people pretend are accidental while they are actually choices. A coworker I used to greet easily now greeted me with forced cheer, like she wanted me to know she was not involved, which told me she felt involved enough to worry. Someone in the hallway asked Lila about her weekend plans within earshot of me, and the question was too loud, too staged, like it was meant to create a public opportunity for her to say she was busy with work. Lila answered with the same language she used at home, and I could almost hear the script in it. And I realized she was not just lying to me anymore, she was building an alibi that needed witnesses. That was a turning point, because once a person recruits the public into their cover story, the public becomes the place where the cover story will eventually die. I started seeing Adrian's behavior differently too, not as a lover hiding, but as a man who wanted credit. He liked being seen. He liked hovering near her desk. He liked the faint thrill of the building knowing something it could not officially say. Men like him do not settle for secret intimacy. They want public validation, because public validation is the real prize. That appetite would be his weakness, because it would push him into riskier choices, and riskier choices leave louder footprints. Everett's role remained the most interesting, because he was still joking, still testing, still acting like he had a vote in my marriage, and I could feel that his power depended on controlling the social temperature of the building. If the story flipped, if the room started treating him as the instigator instead of the entertainer, his authority would shrink quickly, and he knew it, even if he would never admit it. By the end of the week, my folder at home held a clean spine of proof, a merchant alert screenshot, a duplicate receipt with time and location, a shared cloud memory metadata screen with date and location, a printed calendar week view showing overlap, and a neutral witness line recorded in one sentence with a date. None of it required illegal access, none of it required surveillance, none of it relied on rumor, and none of it would sound insane if read by a bored stranger. It was not yet the kind of proof that forces consequences by itself, but it was enough to set a trap. Because traps do not need everything. They only need a moment where the liar commits to a version of reality that cannot survive contact with documentation. The moment arrived quietly, the way it always does, because the most dangerous lies are the ones people deliver with a smile. Lila mentioned the evening commitment again, and she claimed she would not be there, and she did it in front of someone else, casually, as if she were planting a flag. I watched her say it without looking at me, and I understood that she had just moved her cover story from private to public, which meant the next pressure point could not be private anymore either. I did not correct her in that moment, and I did not embarrass her, because embarrassment without structure looks like revenge, and I wanted justice to look like the only logical outcome. I simply made a mental note of who heard her say it. Then I went home, placed the marked calendar overlap on the table, and felt something sharpen inside me that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with timing. Because if she wanted an easy choice, then I was about to give her one, and it would be simple. She could tell the truth now, privately, on her own terms, or she could keep performing until the calendar, the receipts, and the quiet record of her own words forced the truth out of her in a room full of witnesses who would never look at her the same way again. The dinner was supposed to be harmless, the kind of weeknight ritual that keeps a marriage looking intact from the outside, but by the time I started setting plates on the table, I already knew it was going to become a pressure test, because Lila had moved her cover story into public air, and public air has a way of dragging private lies into the light. I did not plan the night like a trap in the cartoon sense, because I did not need theatrics, and I did not want anything that could later be framed as me engineering humiliation. I wanted something simpler, something that looked like normal life continuing, because normal life is where liars get sloppy. I cooked something basic, not celebratory, not punitive, and I kept my movements steady in the kitchen while my mind ran the same quiet loop it had been running for days. Dates, times, locations, and the way she kept trying to blur them with emotion and charm. If you are going to expose someone without becoming the villain in their story, you have to let their own version of reality walk into the room and sit down, and that takes patience that feels like swallowing glass. Lila arrived a little later than she promised, which had become her default, and she entered the house with the same bright energy she had been carrying all week, an energy that did not match the tiredness she kept describing. She greeted me with a soft touch at my shoulder, as if affection could be applied like a sticker. Then she drifted into the kitchen and commented on the food with a warmth that sounded practiced, the way people speak when they want the world to hear the right tone, even if the world is not in the room. I watched her hands as she poured herself water, watched the careful way she placed her phone near her plate with the screen angled away from me, and I felt something almost calm settle into my chest, because a person who is innocent does not arrange objects like shields. She asked about my day with a smile that was too polished for a normal Tuesday, and I answered with enough truth to sound real while keeping the edges dull, because the whole point of my method was to deny her an emotional target. I could see her searching my face for a clue, the same way she did after lunch when the building laughed at my expense, and I could almost hear the question behind her eyes. Was I still manageable? We ate in a quiet that would have felt comfortable a month ago, the normal domestic quiet of forks and small sounds, but now it felt like a room holding its breath. Lila filled the silence with harmless complaints about work and little anecdotes designed to make her seem busy and indispensable, and I let her talk because people give away more when they believe they are controlling the narrative. She mentioned Everett's name once with a casual roll of her eyes, as if he were an annoyance rather than the man who had publicly diminished me and enjoyed it. And she mentioned Adrian's name like he was a passing coworker whose existence had no weight. That choice was telling, because she was trying to reduce Adrian's presence in my mind by shrinking him in language, and language is how liars reduce threats. I nodded and ate and kept my tone level when I asked a simple question about the week ahead, a logistical question that sounded like marriage teamwork, because teamwork is what she believed she could still fake. She answered quickly, then added extra explanation without being asked, and that extra explanation landed like a loose thread, because extra explanation always means fear. When I brought up the shared commitment she had tried to dismiss, I did not frame it as a confrontation, and I did not frame it as an accusation, because framing is where people like Lila find their footing. I framed it like a calendar problem, like two adults trying to coordinate, and I watched how her posture changed before she spoke, because posture changes are the body confessing ahead of the mouth. She said she could not make it. She said it was unavoidable. She said her team needed her, and she said it all with the smooth confidence of someone who had already rehearsed the moral of the story, which was that I should be supportive instead of difficult. I waited until she finished. Then I asked for one detail only, not a speech, not a defense, just one precise thing that would later be measurable, and she gave it to me with a small laugh that tried to make precision sound petty. That laugh was familiar now, the same laugh she had used when Everett joked that I did not deserve her, and I felt the sarcasm in me stir because she was laughing at the idea that facts mattered. I stood up from the table and walked to the small desk by the wall, the one we used for mail and random documents, and I did it without drama, like I was going to grab a pen or check a note. I pulled out the printed calendar week view I had already prepared and placed it on the table between us, because placing paper on a table is not violence, and it is not shouting, and it is not cruelty. It is simply refusing to let someone float above reality. Lila's eyes went straight to the page, then flicked to my face, then back to the page again, and I saw the first real crack in her expression, the moment where she realized she could not charm ink. I did not say anything for a beat, because silence is what makes paper loud, and then I took a pen and marked the overlap with a slow line, steady enough that my hand did not shake, because shaking hands look like emotion, and emotion looks like guilt in the wrong room. I kept my movements clinical, almost boring, because boring is what you want when you are building something that can survive scrutiny. Lila tried to respond the way she always responded when the ground shifted, which was to turn it into a personality issue instead of a factual issue. She asked why I was doing this. She suggested I was being controlling, and she tried to make my calm feel like a threat, because if she could paint me as the unstable one, then her contradictions would become context. I did not rise to it, because rising to it would have been her victory, and instead, I pointed to the page again and asked the same thing I had asked before, only now the paper sat between us like a third person who did not care about feelings. The difference was immediate, because she stopped talking in confident paragraphs and started talking in little adjustments, trying to reshape time with word choices. She said the commitment might move. She said she might have told me the wrong time. She said maybe the invite was not finalized, and I watched her cycle through options the way someone cycles through keys when they cannot find the right one. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, because the calendar was ours, shared and confirmed, and her sudden uncertainty was not about the calendar, it was about the realization that her old tricks were losing power. I took out my phone, not to invade her privacy, not to open anything of hers, but to take a photo of the marked overlap with the wall clock visible in the frame, because time anchoring is a small thing that becomes big later. I did it quietly, without gloating, and I put the phone down again as if it were nothing, because the more casual you are about proof, the more terrifying it becomes to people who have been relying on vagueness. Lila stared at the pen mark like it offended her, like it was unfair that a simple line could make her feel cornered, and I realized in that moment that she had been living in a world where attention and beauty and workplace status acted like shields. In that world, things were always negotiable, always spinnable, always manageable, and now she was facing the one thing that cannot be negotiated: a documented contradiction. The air between us changed, not into shouting, but into something colder, something that made the house feel less like a home and more like a place where outcomes were decided. Lila's voice softened, which is what people do when anger fails and they try intimacy as a weapon, and she shifted toward the language of reassurance, the language of how much she loved me, how work was stressful, how people were just teasing at lunch, how Adrian was nothing. I did not interrupt her, but I did not accept it either, because acceptance would have been permission, and permission is what got us here. I kept my eyes on her and let my face stay unreadable, because if she could not read me, she could not steer me, and steering me was her last real tool. I asked one more question, still logistical, still framed like coordination, and she answered it with another contradiction, smaller than the first, but sharp enough to sting if you cared about truth. It was the kind of contradiction that would have been invisible to me before, because I would have been busy trying to preserve peace, and peace is what liars feed on when they want to keep their double life comfortable. When dinner ended, I cleaned up the plates while she hovered, unsure whether to keep fighting or to retreat into silence. She tried to act normal again, tried to talk about a show we were watching, tried to reattach the evening to routine, and I let her, because routine is what makes the next lie feel safe enough to tell. But inside, I was adding the new entries to the ledger with the calm certainty of a man watching a bridge collapse one bolt at a time. I wrote down the exact cover story she used for the evening commitment. I wrote down the adjustment she attempted when the calendar appeared, and I wrote down the second contradiction she slipped into while trying to reassure me. I did not write that she was guilty, because guilt is an interpretation, but I wrote that her story changed twice within minutes, and that is a fact. Then I slid the marked calendar page into a clear sleeve with a small date label, because organization is the opposite of obsession, and I wanted this to look like what it was, a simple record of events prepared by a man who refused to be gaslit into confusion. That night, Lila slept poorly, and I could tell because her body shifted more than usual, like her mind was running through possible futures and trying to find the one where she kept her image intact. I lay awake and stared at the ceiling, not because I was suffering romantically, but because I was calculating the next step. The dinner had done what I needed it to do, which was force her to commit to a cover story on the record of our shared life, a cover story now contradicted by a simple calendar and a simple photograph. The next step could not be another private pressure test, because she would tighten up now, and tightening meant she would recruit allies, and allies meant the story would move into HR territory, where process and perception become weapons. I needed to anticipate that shift, because Dana Voss, the HR chief, was not the kind of person who waited to be involved, and Everett was not the kind of boss who risked looking reckless. If the social scaffolding began to wobble, they would try to stabilize it by framing me as the problem, and I would need to be ready to counter that with something even colder than a marked calendar, documentation that could survive a professional room. In the morning, Lila acted overly sweet, which is always the tell that someone is afraid of what you might do next, and she offered to make breakfast as if eggs could erase a pen line. I accepted the food, thanked her, and kept my tone light, because I wanted her to believe she still had time. Then she mentioned, casually, that HR had been asking about team dynamics lately, and she said it like a random observation, but the timing was too convenient to be random. That was the moment I knew the workplace machine had already started turning, and I felt something tighten behind my ribs, not fear, but focus. I had seen the first layer of betrayal in the laugh, and I had seen the second layer in the receipts and the calendar, but now I was seeing the third layer, the institutional layer, the one that makes personal humiliation dangerous because it can turn into professional damage if you let the wrong people control the narrative. I finished my coffee, rinsed my mug, and went to work with my folder quiet in my bag and my expression calm on my face. Because calm is the only mask that matters when you are walking into a building that thinks it can rewrite you. Somewhere inside that building, Lila believed she could still choose the easiest path, the one where she kept her admiration and kept her marriage and kept her reputation, and Adrian probably believed he could keep smiling until everyone got bored. Everett believed his jokes were power, and Dana believed process belonged to her. None of them understood that the easiest choices are the ones that create clean records, and clean records do not care who laughs. By the time I walked into the building that morning, I could feel the air had changed, not because anyone had said anything to me directly, but because people with secrets always start rearranging the room around the secret. The smiles were a little too careful, the greetings a little too warm, and the pauses in conversation a little too timed, as if someone had coached them on how to behave around a potential problem without admitting there was a problem. Lila moved through that environment like she belonged to it, like the building was an extension of her mirror, and Adrian drifted close enough to her workstation to be noticed without being obvious, which is how men like him keep their appetite fed without taking on risk. Everett floated through the floor with his manager's grin and his casual ownership of everyone's mood, and I watched him with the same detached attention you give a fire that has not reached your house yet. Behind all of that, I could sense Dana Voss, the way you sense a door closing somewhere down a hallway, because HR does not wait for conflict to become real. HR waits for conflict to become useful. I did not go to HR first, and I did not ask questions that would announce my awareness, because the first rule of survival in a narrative war is to refuse to become the loudest person in the story. I went to my desk, did my work, answered messages, and acted like a man who had not just marked his wife's lies on paper at the dinner table. That normalcy was not denial, it was camouflage, and camouflage is what keeps predators careless. Around mid-morning, my calendar pinged with a team check-in I had scheduled weeks earlier, a routine session meant to align tasks and reduce friction, the kind of meeting nobody feared. I stared at the invite and felt the timing click into place, because routine meetings are the best arenas when you want witnesses without spectacle. If Lila and Adrian and Everett were building their confidence in public, then public would be where the scaffolding cracked, but it had to crack in a way that looked like consequence, not a tantrum. I spent the next hour doing something that would have looked boring to anyone watching, because boredom is the mask of preparation. I reviewed my folder, not like a man obsessing, but like a man checking the integrity of a file. I had the merchant alert screenshot printed and signed, the duplicate receipt stapled behind it, the shared cloud memory metadata screen saved with date and location visible, the printed calendar week view with the overlap marked, and the one-sentence neutral witness line I had recorded and dated. I added clear sleeves to each piece, not because plastic makes truth stronger, but because plastic keeps paper clean, and clean paper reads as credible in rooms that worship process. I wrote a simple cover sheet that did not accuse anyone of cheating, because accusations invite debate, but listed only facts in a table: date, time, place, and source of proof. I kept the language plain, the formatting tight, and the tone flat, because flat tone is what keeps people from claiming you are unstable. When I walked to the meeting room, I carried the sleeves in a plain folder, the kind that could have held quarterly reports. The room itself was unremarkable, a rectangle with folding chairs and a screen at the front, the kind of space where people pretend collaboration happens while they mostly wait for someone else to lead. The air smelled faintly of copier toner and old coffee, and the overhead lights had that harsh corporate brightness that makes everyone look slightly tired, which was useful because fatigue makes people sloppy. I arrived early, because early arrival gives you control of silent details without looking controlling, and I placed one clear sleeve packet on each chair before anyone entered. I did not tape anything to walls, I did not project anything on the screen, and I did not make a speech to an empty room like a man rehearsing revenge. I simply placed the packets where hands would naturally reach them, and then I stepped back and waited, because the most effective ambush is the one that looks like it was always supposed to be there. People began to filter in, 2 at a time, carrying laptops and paper cups, and the soft impatience of employees who want meetings to end before they begin. The first person reached for the chair and noticed the sleeve, paused, and lifted it with a small frown. They looked at me as if to ask what it was, but I did not offer an explanation, because explanation is where drama begins. Another person sat down, found their packet, opened it, and their eyebrows lifted in that involuntary way that means they have just encountered something they did not expect to see in a work context. A low ripple of page turning began, the soft plastic crackle of sleeves being opened, the faint squeak of folding chairs shifting under bodies that had suddenly become more alert. Nobody laughed. Nobody made jokes. The room's usual casual noise died down, replaced by that silence people adopt when they are reading something they know will change how they have to behave. Lila entered with a confident stride that slowed a fraction when she saw the room's posture, because her social instincts were sharp enough to notice when attention had shifted away from her control. She took a seat and found the sleeve waiting, and for a second her face held that polite neutrality people use at work. But then I saw the exact moment she recognized her own timeline in black ink. Her fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the plastic, and she glanced around to see who was reading what, because her first impulse was not understanding, it was damage control. Adrian walked in behind her, smiled like he always did, and the smile thinned when he noticed the packets. He picked one up, skimmed, and his eyes moved faster than they should have, the way eyes move when they are searching for the line that kills them. Everett arrived last, wearing his manager's relaxed confidence, and the confidence faltered when he saw the room's silence, because silence is always a threat to a man whose power depends on being the entertainer. I did not call the meeting to order immediately because order was already happening, and it was happening through paper. I watched the room absorb the facts, watched the flickers of recognition as people connected dates to jokes they had heard, to late work lines they had repeated, to the invisible assumptions that had made Lila look like the admired one and me look like the tolerated one. I could see the mental math in their faces, not because they were trying to be moral, but because they were trying to protect themselves from being associated with something ugly. That is the thing about offices. People do not change their behavior because they suddenly love truth. They change their behavior because they fear being caught on the wrong side of a record. When I finally began the meeting, I did it the same way I always did, with an agenda that had nothing to do with my marriage, because I was not turning a work session into a confessional, and I was not going to gift anyone a reason to claim I misused the workplace. I talked about deadlines and responsibilities and next steps, and I kept my voice even, almost boring, because boredom in my voice made the packets feel even louder. People tried to follow along, but their attention kept drifting back to the sleeves, to the table of dates and places and payments, to the marked overlap on the calendar, to the signed merchant alert printout. Lila sat stiffly, her eyes occasionally darting to Adrian and then away, as if she wanted to coordinate, but could not risk it in front of witnesses who were now watching her more closely than before. Adrian tried to regain control by offering a few helpful comments, but his tone was too bright, the way it gets when someone is trying to sound casual while their nervous system is screaming. Everett attempted a joke, a small one, a harmless one, but it died mid-air because nobody rewarded it, and the absence of laughter hit him harder than any accusation would have. The real pressure arrived not from anything I said, but from what I refused to say. I did not look at Lila with anger, and I did not look at Adrian with jealousy. And I did not look at Everett like a man demanding an apology. I treated them like coworkers in a room where documentation existed, and that treatment forced them to confront the possibility that this was not an emotional blow-up they could manage. An emotional blow-up would have been easy for them because HR knows how to discipline emotion. Documentation is harder because documentation migrates, and once it migrates into official spaces, it starts making demands. After the meeting ended, people did not linger the way they usually did, chatting and stretching out the last minutes before returning to their desks. They stood, gathered their things, and moved out with that quick efficiency people adopt when they want to avoid being asked what they think. A few left the sleeve packets on their chairs as if touching them longer would implicate them, but several tucked them into their bags, not as souvenirs, but as insurance, because employees collect insurance when they sense leadership might be compromised. Lila waited until the room was nearly empty before she approached me, and her face carried a controlled softness that tried to imply concern without admitting fear. She did not ask what I was doing in a direct way, because direct questions can be quoted later, and she had always understood the value of plausible deniability. Adrian hovered nearby, pretending to look at his phone, but his posture was angled toward us, the way it gets when someone expects a confrontation that would let them play the victim. I did not give them a confrontation. I gathered the remaining sleeves calmly, stacked them, and slid them into my folder, leaving no messy paper trail in the room that could be photographed out of context. I nodded at Lila as if we were discussing nothing more than meeting logistics, and I walked out without raising my voice, because the trap was not a shouting match. The trap was the existence of a record that had now been witnessed. In the hallway, I felt the building's attention follow me in a new way, not amused, not pitying, but wary, because people had realized I was not the soft target they had been laughing at. That change was small, but it was the first crack in the social scaffolding Lila and Everett had been building, and cracks are what make the next step possible. By late afternoon, the consequences started arriving in quiet forms. Messages that used to be casual became formal. Invitations that used to include Lila's name now arrived without it. A colleague who had once avoided my eyes stopped by my desk and asked a work question with a strange extra politeness, the kind you use when you have decided someone might be dangerous. I did not smile at the shift, because smiling would have made it feel like victory, and I was not chasing victory. I was chasing a clean outcome. I went home that evening, opened my folder, and added a new entry to the ledger. Evidence packets witnessed in a team setting, reactions observed, jokes died, and the room changed. Then I placed the sleeves back into their clear protective covers and labeled the day's date, because now this was not just my private record, it was a documented moment of public awareness. Lila came home later than usual, and she tried to be sweet again, but sweetness only works when it is voluntary, not tactical. She asked if we could talk, and I told her I was tired, not because I wanted to punish her with silence, but because I wanted her to sit in uncertainty a little longer. Uncertainty is what forces liars to make mistakes, and mistakes are what create the next piece of proof. I went to bed with my mind quiet, not because I felt peace, but because I felt the next door beginning to open, the door that led into HR's world where Dana Voss controlled outcomes, and where my folder would either be treated as a problem or as a trigger. The next morning, my calendar pinged with a new meeting invite from HR, and the subject line was polite enough to look harmless to anyone who had not been paying attention. I stared at it for a moment, saved the header, and felt my pulse slow into something colder, because now the fight was not just about my wife's choices. Now it was about who got to write the official story. The HR invite sat on my screen like a smile that hid teeth, polite in wording and sharp in timing, and the subject line was crafted to look helpful to anyone who might later read it. It was framed as a routine check-in about team dynamics, workplace wellness, and communication, the kind of language that lets HR pretend it is neutral, while it quietly chooses which side of reality it wants to protect. I saved the header immediately, because headers are where intent lives, and intent becomes important when people start claiming misunderstandings. Then I closed the invite without responding, not because I was refusing it, but because I wanted the first move to be mine, and HR's favorite trick is to pull you into a room before you have your own record ready. I walked to the restroom, splashed water on my face, and studied my reflection in the mirror, because I needed to make sure my expression looked like what it was: calm, tired, and uninterested in theatrics. The building had already decided I was either a problem or a subject, and I was not going to give it the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. On the way back to my desk, I saw Lila in the hallway, and I could tell she had already heard about the meeting, because HR does not schedule things like that without letting certain people know, and she carried a thin tension behind her smile as if she were trying to hold a glass of water without spilling. She asked casually if I had seen the invite, and the casualness was too deliberate, the way people speak when they are trying to make something feel normal that is not normal at all. I nodded and kept walking, and she followed me for a few steps, matching my pace, asking if everything was okay, which is the question people ask when they actually mean, "Are you going to ruin me?" I did not answer the question the way she wanted, because I did not owe her comfort while she was still choosing the lie, and I did not owe the building a scene. I simply told her I would handle it, and I watched her shoulders relax by a millimeter, because her biggest fear was not that she had betrayed me. Her biggest fear was losing control of the narrative. Dana Voss's office was on a quiet corridor that always felt too clean, too intentional, the kind of space designed to make people feel small without admitting it. When the meeting time arrived, I went alone, because bringing an ally looks like paranoia, and paranoia is the word HR loves most. The reception area smelled like air freshener and paper, and the chairs were arranged in a way that suggested you should be grateful for the privilege of being questioned. An HR rep greeted me with a professional smile and asked me to wait, and I sat there with my hands relaxed on my knees, breathing slow, because my body language was part of the case now. If I walked in angry, they would write angry. If I walked in anxious, they would write unstable. If I walked in calm, they would have to work harder to invent a frame that fit. Dana entered a few minutes later, wearing a tailored suit and a friendly expression that did not reach her eyes, and she extended her hand like we were about to negotiate something. Her office was neat in a way that felt performative, no clutter, no personal objects that might suggest she was human, and on the wall behind her desk hung framed policy language in a style that made it look like art. She gestured for me to sit, offered water, and began with the kind of soft empathy HR uses when it wants you to relax enough to incriminate yourself. She said she had noticed some tension on the team. She said she wanted to ensure everyone felt safe and supported. And she said she wanted to understand how I was doing, because sometimes personal stress can affect professional interactions. The words were gentle, but the structure was aggressive, because she was not asking about facts, she was asking about me, and that was the tell. I let her finish without interrupting, because I wanted her to commit to the frame fully before I dismantled it. Then I asked a simple question, a procedural question, delivered calmly, the kind of question that forces HR to show its hand, whether this was an informal wellness check-in or a formal meeting that would be documented. Dana's smile tightened slightly, because she had expected emotion, not procedure, and she answered with careful language that tried to keep both doors open. She said it was informal, but she also said she would take notes to ensure accuracy, because HR always wants the option to turn informal into formal later. I nodded, reached into my folder, and took out 2 pages only: the relevant policy section about workplace conduct and conflicts, and the first page of my table of facts, the one that listed dates, places, payments, and sources without any emotional commentary. I placed them on the desk between us with the same calm I would use placing a document on a counter, and I watched Dana's eyes move down the page as her expression adjusted from empathy to calculation. She did not read it all at once because she was scanning for the angle that would let her stay in control, but the table was not built for angles. It was built for clarity. I told her, in plain language, that my concern was not a personal disagreement and not a team vibe problem, but a documented pattern of boundary violations that had begun publicly, had been witnessed by employees, and had started to distort professional interactions. I did not say the word affair because affair is a romantic word and romance is where HR likes to trap you. And instead, I used the kind of language HR respects even when it hates it: documented conflicts, misuse of authority through public humiliation, and workplace behavior impacting professionalism. Dana's fingers touched her pen, and I saw the moment she realized she could not comfortably write me as unstable, if I was speaking like a man protecting process. She tried to pivot anyway, because that is what she does for a living. She asked whether I felt threatened, whether I had felt targeted, whether I had experienced harassment, and the questions sounded supportive, but they were building a path toward framing me as emotional and reactive. I answered each question briefly, without decoration, and I kept returning to the same point. I had a record of specific events, and I wanted to know the correct reporting channel. I showed her the HR invite header I had saved, and I pointed out that the meeting itself, scheduled after a team session where evidence packets had been read, created the appearance of retaliation or narrative management if it was not handled properly. The word appearance landed hard because HR lives on appearance, and suddenly Dana was forced to consider how her own actions might look if this went beyond her office. She nodded slowly, made a note, and her tone changed from nurturing to cautious, because cautious is what HR becomes when it senses it might be the one under review. Dana asked where I got the information in the table, and the question was designed to test whether I had violated privacy, because if she could label my proof as improper, she could discard it and keep the story intact. I explained clearly and calmly that every item came from lawful household-level sources: a merchant alert on an account I owned, a duplicate receipt from a merchant for my own transaction, a shared cloud album metadata screen visible to me by agreement, and a shared calendar conflict visible to me because we share the calendar. I did not mention the neutral witness line by name, because I was not interested in dragging a stranger into HR's machine, and I did not need it yet. Dana's pen paused again, because the absence of privacy violation cut off one of her favorite escape routes. Without a violation to condemn, she was left with the uncomfortable reality that I had built a clean record inside the boundaries of normal life. She leaned back slightly and asked whether I had spoken to my wife about these concerns, and the question was framed like a reasonable suggestion, but it was actually a trap. If I admitted I had confronted her emotionally, HR could write it as marital conflict spilling into work. If I admitted I had not, HR could write me as passive-aggressive. I answered with the simplest truth that served both reality and procedure. I had asked for clarification on a few logistical contradictions, and I had been met with changing explanations, which was why I was choosing the correct reporting channel rather than escalating privately. That answer kept the focus on process, and I watched Dana's eyes narrow slightly, because she could not turn it into a messy he said she said without looking careless. Then she did something revealing, the kind of move that tells you exactly who she is protecting. She mentioned lightly that rumors can spread in workplaces and that it is important to avoid creating a hostile environment, and she suggested that distributing packets in a team meeting might be perceived as disruptive. The word perceived was doing a lot of work, because she was trying to scold me without acknowledging what the packets contained. I kept my tone steady and reminded her that the packets contained only documented facts and that I had not accused anyone in the room of anything verbally, and I asked whether policy prohibited employees from sharing factual documentation relevant to workplace conduct. Dana did not answer directly, because direct answers create commitments, and HR hates commitments. She said she would need to review, and she asked for copies, and the request sounded routine, but it was the beginning of her attempt to take ownership of the record. I handed her copies of only what I was comfortable submitting, which was the table and the policy line, and I kept the originals in my folder because ownership matters. Dana watched me do it, and I could see she did not like that I had boundaries, because HR prefers you either compliant or chaotic, not careful. She asked whether I wanted to file an official report, and now the tone was business, not empathy, and I felt the first real shift in the room. I said yes, but I said it in the cleanest possible terms. I wanted a compliance report logged, with a case number, based on documented facts, and I wanted assurance that any follow-up would be handled without retaliation or narrative shaping. The phrase narrative shaping hung in the air like a bad smell, because Dana understood exactly what I meant, and she knew I had noticed her machinery. For a moment, she tried one last angle, the one that makes people fold, the one where HR implies consequences if you do not cooperate. She mentioned that policy violations can be serious for all parties, and she suggested that it might be best to keep things contained while the company assesses, and she looked at me like she expected fear. I did not give her fear. I nodded and said I agreed that policy matters, which was why the record needed to be clean, and then I asked again, politely, for the official case number once the report was logged. Dana's eyes flicked to her screen, and she typed, and the sound of keys in that quiet office felt like a gavel. She read out the case ID, not loudly, not dramatically, but she read it, and I wrote it down immediately on my legal pad, because the difference between rumor and consequence is the existence of a number in a system. When the meeting ended, Dana offered another polite smile, and she told me she appreciated my professionalism, which was her way of claiming she had been in control all along. I thanked her, stood, and walked out without rushing, because rushing looks like relief, and relief looks like weakness. In the hallway, I exhaled slowly and felt the building's air hit my face like cold water. The scaffolding had shifted again, because now there was a case number inside the institution, and institutions do not like cases that can embarrass them. I returned to my desk and saved the HR invite header again in my folder. Then I wrote a new ledger entry in plain language. HR meeting held, policy and proof submitted, case number logged, and my request for non-retaliation stated. That afternoon, Lila's behavior changed in small ways that told me she had been briefed. She was sweeter on the surface and sharper underneath, the way people get when they realize their private life has entered an official channel. Adrian avoided my eyes entirely, which was a shift from his earlier smugness, and Everett's jokes became less pointed, more cautious, because even he understood that HR case numbers are not comedy. I watched all of them from a distance that felt strange, because there is a loneliness to being the only person in a room who knows the entire truth, but loneliness is still better than being gaslit. I went home that night and placed the paper with the case number into a clear sleeve, dated it, and set it behind the marked calendar overlap, because now the story had crossed a threshold. It was no longer just my record against her story. It was my record inside the machine that had the power to create consequences. And somewhere inside that machine, I could feel Dana Voss doing what she does best, which is trying to control the outcome by controlling the language. That meant the next phase would not be about proving Lila lied, because I had already done that in quiet steps. The next phase would be about preventing them from rewriting me as the problem, because people like Lila do not just betray, they pre-frame, and the moment you threaten their image, they reach for the oldest weapon in the book, a narrative that turns your calm into menace. By the next Monday, the building had done what buildings always do when truth threatens comfort, because it tried to turn the person holding the record into the problem holding everyone back. The shift was not loud, but it was consistent, like a slow leak you only notice when the carpet starts to smell, and I could feel it in the way people stopped speaking when I approached, then resumed with forced brightness once I passed. It was in the way my manager suddenly asked if I was doing okay, not as a friend, but as a witness preparing for a future statement. It was in the way small requests I used to handle casually now arrived with extra people copied, as if the company wanted a paper trail of my tone, my timing, my behavior, because HR's favorite trick is to harvest neutral interactions and frame them later as patterns. Lila, for her part, became a master of visible innocence, the kind of innocence that only exists when someone is performing it for an audience, and she started speaking about me in that careful third-person way people use when they want their words to survive retelling. I noticed it first in a team chat I was only loosely part of, where someone dropped a harmless comment about stress and boundaries, then followed it with a supportive emoji aimed in Lila's direction. It looked trivial, but it was the kind of trivial that gets used later, because once a workplace starts whispering about boundaries, It has already selected the villain, and the villain is usually the man who refuses to smile through disrespect. I did not reply, because replying would have made me part of the thread, and I had learned that the less you say, the less they can distort. Instead, I kept doing my job with almost exaggerated calm, showing up on time, meeting deadlines, keeping my voice level, and staying boring in every professional way that matters, because boring makes it harder for HR to write you as volatile. Dana Voss had logged a case number, and that number was now a living thing inside the company, and living things attract people who want control. Lila tried a different tactic at home, and it was almost impressive in its cynicism, because she switched from sweetness to concern in the exact tone HR uses, as if she were practicing her statement in real time. She asked whether I had been sleeping, whether work had been a lot, whether I felt overwhelmed by everything, and she asked it with wide eyes, like she was worried about my well-being rather than worried about her consequences. She suggested we could talk to someone. She suggested I should take time off. She suggested that maybe I had been misreading situations because I felt insecure. The language was subtle but unmistakable, because it was not aimed at me, it was aimed at a future audience, the kind of audience that hears a calm man described as unstable and believes it because the description arrives wearing the costume of compassion. I listened without reacting, and I let her talk, because every attempt to paint you becomes another part of the record if you stay steady enough to see it. I did not accuse her of trying to pre-frame me, even though that was exactly what she was doing, because accusing her would have turned the conversation into a fight about intent, and intent is where liars thrive. Instead, I asked one question only, delivered with a tired tone that sounded almost indifferent, which was whether she had raised concerns about me at work. Her pause was half a second too long, and her eyes flicked away, and then she answered with a small laugh that tried to make the question sound paranoid. She said, "Of course not." She said she would never bring our personal life into the workplace, and she said it with the same smooth certainty she used when she claimed she had been working late at times I could now document. I nodded and let it drop, because the point was not to trap her in the moment. The point was to let her commit to the lie so it would cost her later. The next morning, I got the proof I needed without seeking it, because people who are trying to look innocent often overperform in public, and overperformance leaves fingerprints. A coworker I barely spoke to, someone who had always hovered near the edges of office social circles, stopped me near the coffee machine and asked, with forced casualness, whether everything was okay between me and Lila. The phrasing was careful, as if it had been coached, and the tone carried that soft pity people use when they think they are being kind, while they are actually participating in a narrative. I answered calmly that I was fine, and that I preferred to keep personal matters private, and I watched the coworker's face tighten slightly because my refusal to play along denied them the validation they wanted. Then the coworker said, a little too quickly, that it was just that Lila seemed stressed and had mentioned being worried about me. I did not react, but internally I felt the ledger click, because now Lila had begun spreading her framing into the building, which meant my question from the night before had been answered by her own behavior. That same day, a new piece of evidence arrived in the most ordinary way, because ordinary life is where careless people get caught. I was scrolling through my own social feed during lunch, not hunting, not stalking, just consuming the same noise everyone consumes to kill time, and I saw a public tag in a story from a local charity committee account, the kind of group that posts smiling photos to prove it exists. Lila had been involved with that committee before, and she still followed it, which meant her face would not be unusual there. But what caught my attention was the background detail that did not match her recent narrative. The story showed a small cluster of people in a warmly lit hotel lobby bar, and Lila was there in the frame, angled toward someone just out of view, smiling with the relaxed intimacy she never wore at home anymore. The timestamp on the story was from the same evening she had claimed she was trapped in a late meeting, and the location tag matched the same general area as the earlier cloud metadata mismatch, not identical, but close enough to feel like a pattern rather than coincidence. I did not need to zoom into faces or invent meaning because the platform had already done the work by stamping date and place, and I saved a screenshot of the public tag with the date stamp visible. The evidence was not, "she is cheating," in the simplistic sense, because human behavior always has plausible deniability, but it was, "she is somewhere she said she was not," and that kind of proof has a special cruelty because it is quiet. I placed the screenshot into my folder later that night, printed it, and signed the back with the date because signed printouts look like intention, and intention is what survives when people start claiming you doctored things. I wrote a new ledger entry describing the story in plain language, and I underlined the only part that mattered, the public tag and the timestamp, because time is the witness that does not negotiate. The atmosphere at work grew tighter after that, as if the company could sense the truth approaching like weather. Dana's team sent me a follow-up email thanking me for raising concerns and reminding me that retaliation was prohibited, a sentence that sounded supportive until you realized it existed mostly to protect the company from liability. I saved the email header. Then my manager requested a quick check-in to make sure I felt supported, and the way the meeting was worded felt like another attempt to create a record of my emotional state. I attended, stayed calm, spoke briefly, and kept everything focused on workload and deliverables, because the more you sound normal, the less oxygen their narrative has. Still, I could feel their frustration building, because they had been hoping I would either explode or confess insecurity, and I kept refusing both options like a man refusing a bad contract. Lila started staying later again, and now she began leaving the house with small, careful changes to her routine, like taking calls outside, like turning her phone face down, like dressing slightly sharper for late meetings, the kind of details that would have been flattering once, and now just looked like costume changes between lives. One evening, she came home with a thin red line on her wrist that looked like it had come from a hotel event band, and she tried to hide it by washing her hands quickly and keeping her sleeves down. I did not mention it, because mentioning it would have taught her to stop being sloppy, and sloppiness was where the next truth would come from. Instead, I waited until she fell asleep, and then I checked our entryway shelf where she often dropped keys and small items, and I found a folded valet ticket tucked under a flyer, the kind of paper people hide without realizing that hiding is what makes it noticeable. The ticket had a time printed on it, and the time aligned with the window she had insisted she was in a meeting. I photographed it beside the day's newspaper on the kitchen table because that was a lawful, ordinary way to anchor time, and then I returned the ticket to where I found it, because the point was not to steal, the point was to document. By the end of the week, I could see the shape of the next move coming, because institutions do not like slow truths, they like sudden closures. Dana sent another invite, this one labeled as a resolution meeting, and it included Everett, Lila, Adrian, Dana, and a neutral facilitator from another HR unit whose name I had never seen before. The meeting location was not Dana's office anymore, but a larger conference room near the executive floor, the kind of room that makes people feel watched. The agenda attached to the invite was vague, full of words like alignment, professionalism, and moving forward, which is HR language for deciding who gets sacrificed to keep the building stable. I stared at the invite and felt my pulse slow because I understood what they were trying to do. They were trying to compress the story into a neat internal conclusion before the record grew teeth. That night at home, Lila tried one last push to control me emotionally, and it was almost tender in its cruelty. She told me she loved me. She told me she was scared. She told me she felt like I was turning into someone she did not recognize, and she said it all while watching my face like a weather forecast. I listened and nodded and kept my voice soft, and then I asked her, gently, to repeat the cover story she had told people at work about the evening of the hotel lobby story. She frowned and asked why, and I told her I wanted to understand her timeline clearly, so there would be no misunderstandings. She repeated the story, and she added a new detail, and the new detail contradicted the valet ticket time by a clean, undeniable margin. She did not know she had just handed me the final piece of the pattern, and that ignorance was the only mercy she was going to get from me. When she went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table, spread the sleeves out in a neat row, and built a one-page date-place payment table that could be read in under 30 seconds by anyone with a functioning brain. Merchant alert, duplicate receipt, shared cloud metadata, calendar overlap, public tag story screenshot, valet ticket time, and HR case number, all aligned in a simple sequence that showed one thing clearly. The lies were not random. They were coordinated. I slid the one-page table into a clear sleeve, dated it, and placed it on top of the stack because the resolution meeting was coming, and I had no interest in being negotiated into silence. On my way to bed, I paused at the doorway and looked at Lila's sleeping face, and for a second I felt the old grief try to rise, the grief of realizing you married someone who could laugh while you were cut in public. Then the grief settled into something cleaner, something harder, because grief is still emotion, and emotion was exactly what Dana and Everett and Adrian were counting on to control me. I turned off the light, lay down, and stared into the dark, knowing that the next room would not be a private argument or a marriage talk. The next room would be a conference room where minutes could be taken, where witnesses would be present, and where the company would try to decide who should be labeled the problem. And this time, I was walking in with a record that did not need my anger to speak. The resolution meeting was scheduled for late afternoon, which was not an accident, because late afternoon is when people are tired enough to agree to anything that promises closure. I arrived 10 minutes early and walked past the executive floor's glass walls and polished silence, watching my reflection move in those panels like a man being escorted to his own sentencing, except I was not there to be sentenced, and that difference mattered more than anyone in that building understood. The conference room sat at the end of a corridor with framed mission statements and corporate photographs that looked like staged sincerity, and the door was already cracked open, which told me they expected me to enter as if this were a favor, not a procedure. I carried my folder like it held budget reports, and I kept my posture relaxed, because the only way to beat an institution that feeds on your reaction is to starve it. Inside, the table was set with water bottles and notepads, the little props HR uses to make control look like care, and a laptop was positioned near the center with its screen angled toward the chair at the head of the table. Dana Voss sat near that laptop, neatly composed, eyes alert, pen ready, and beside her sat Everett Dale with a half-smile that tried to convey managerial warmth while hiding irritation. Lila sat across from Dana, shoulders back, hands folded, face arranged into calm concern, and Adrian sat to her left, with his usual polished grooming, though his jaw was tighter than usual, as if he had learned that charm loses value when records appear. At the far end sat the neutral facilitator, a woman named Evelyn Park, introduced in the invite as an HR business partner from another unit, which was corporate code for someone brought in to make the outcome look fair. Evelyn's expression was professional and quiet, the kind that invites people to talk themselves into trouble, and she placed a small digital recorder on the table without announcing it, because the recorder did not exist unless someone wanted it to exist. I sat down without greeting anyone like a friend, because this was not a family talk, and I did not owe anyone warmth in a room designed to manage me. Evelyn began with the usual language about alignment, respect, and moving forward, and she said she wanted to ensure everyone felt heard, which is what facilitators say when they are about to prioritize the company's comfort over anyone's truth. Dana nodded along as if she were a neutral observer, though I could see in her eyes the careful calculation of someone deciding what would be safe to acknowledge. Everett offered a soft comment about valuing professionalism and team cohesion, and the word cohesion sounded like a warning, because cohesion is what leaders demand when they want the problem to stop being visible. Lila watched me with that sympathetic look she had been practicing, the one that frames my calm as something possibly troubling, and Adrian kept his eyes on the notepad in front of him like a student, hoping the teacher does not call on him. Evelyn asked me to share my perspective first, which was not generosity, because the first speaker is usually the one whose words get edited into the frame later. I thanked her for the time, kept my voice low, and said I would be brief, because brevity is a weapon when the other side needs you to ramble. I told them my concern was not feelings or gossip, but a documented pattern of workplace boundary violations and narrative manipulation that had begun in public and had already altered professional interactions. I said I had reported through the proper channel, that a case number had been logged, and that I had prepared a one-page factual timeline for this meeting to avoid misunderstandings. Then I placed the single sleeve on the table, slid it toward Evelyn first, and waited, because waiting forces people to reveal whether they respect process or fear it. Evelyn glanced at the page, and I saw the moment her eyebrows lifted slightly at how clean the structure was, because clean structure is what makes HR nervous when it is not theirs. Dana reached for the sleeve with a practiced calm that tried to imply ownership, and Everett leaned forward as if he were curious, though his eyes narrowed when he saw the dates aligned. Lila's face held its sympathetic mask until she spotted the public tag screenshot and the valet ticket time, and then the mask tightened. Adrian's gaze flicked to the merchant receipt line, and he looked away too quickly, because the receipt was a hard object in a world he preferred to keep soft. I did not speak while they read, because the page did not need a narrator, and I had learned that the less you decorate truth, the more brutal it becomes. When Evelyn finished scanning, she cleared her throat and asked, in a careful tone, whether the sources were lawful and relevant. I answered simply that every item came from household-level sources I was entitled to see, including a shared calendar, a shared cloud album, a merchant alert on an account I owned, a duplicate receipt for my own transaction, a public social tag visible to anyone, and a valet ticket found in my own home. Dana's pen paused for a fraction of a second, because privacy violations would have been her easiest escape hatch, and I had left that hatch sealed. Everett tried to smile, as if this was all a misunderstanding, and he said it was unfortunate that personal matters were affecting the workplace, which was his first attempt to shrink the entire situation into marital conflict. I responded without raising my tone, and said the workplace became involved the moment a supervisor chose to publicly humiliate an employee's spouse, and the moment coworkers escalated the humiliation into public boundary crossing during work hours. Everett's smile thinned, because I had just tied his joke to his role, and he did not like being named as a component rather than a spectator. Lila spoke next, and her voice was gentle, controlled, and perfectly aimed at HR ears. She said she felt unsafe lately, not physically, but emotionally, because I had become cold, and she said she was worried I was spiraling because I seemed obsessed with collecting things. The word collecting was chosen carefully, because it implied paranoia rather than documentation, and I could see Dana relax slightly, because this was the frame she preferred. Adrian added a small comment about how he had always tried to be friendly, how he never intended harm, and how he felt uncomfortable with private information being circulated, which was ironic coming from a man who had been comfortable asking my wife out in front of witnesses. Everett took advantage of the momentum and suggested we should focus on restoring a respectful working environment, implying that my actions had disrupted harmony. In the space of 2 minutes, they had attempted to turn my record into misconduct and my restraint into instability, and the only reason they thought it would work was because many people are trained to trust tone over facts. I did not argue with their feelings, because arguing with feelings is how you lose to people who weaponize feelings. Instead, I asked Evelyn for one procedural thing, delivered politely, which was whether this meeting had minutes and whether those minutes would reflect what was submitted as evidence. Evelyn said she would note key points, and Dana said HR would maintain records as appropriate, which was a slippery answer designed to keep discretion. I nodded, then asked a second procedural question, which was whether Lila wished to stand by her claim that she had not raised concerns about me at work, since she had denied it at home. Lila's eyes flicked toward Dana, and that flick was the first real crack in her performance, because she had not expected me to phrase it as a consistency check, rather than an accusation. She said she had only mentioned being stressed, only sought support, only wanted help navigating the situation, and her language was carefully vague, because vagueness is how you avoid being pinned. Evelyn leaned forward slightly and asked Lila a simple, clarifying question about dates, because facilitators love dates when they smell a contradiction. Lila offered a date, then adjusted it, then tried to soften the adjustment with a small laugh, and the laugh sounded wrong in that room, because the room was not amused. I let the laugh hang, then I slid one additional sleeve forward, not the whole stack, just one page, the one where I had written her denial from the dinner conversation in plain language, dated and signed on the back like a note to myself. I did not claim it was a transcript, and I did not claim it was an audio record, because it was not, and I did not need to pretend otherwise. I simply said I had asked her directly, and she had denied bringing our personal matters into the workplace, and now she was describing an HR support path that began before the case number existed. Dana's pen moved faster, because now the conflict was no longer about a husband's feelings. It was about timeline integrity, and timeline integrity is where HR gets nervous. Everett tried to cut in with a comment about not litigating personal conversations, but Evelyn stopped him with a calm gesture, because facilitators dislike interruptions that look like control. Adrian shifted in his chair and said he felt targeted, and he suggested I was trying to damage reputations, which was a cheap play for moral high ground. I looked at him and said, evenly, that I was not asking anyone to believe rumors, and I was not asking anyone to choose sides, and I was not asking anyone to punish anyone based on emotion. I said I was asking this room to acknowledge documented contradictions and to apply policy consistently, because policy is what the company uses when it wants to pretend it is principled. The sarcasm stayed in my head where it belonged, but the implication was clear, because if the company refused to apply policy to the people with social power, then the company's claims about values were decorative lies. Dana leaned into a new line of attack, the one designed to make me the procedural problem. She said distributing evidence packets in a team meeting could be seen as creating an uncomfortable environment, and she implied it could be considered harassment. I asked politely whether she was alleging the documents were false or whether she was alleging the documents were true but inconvenient. Dana did not answer directly, because direct answers are dangerous, and she said she was focusing on impact, not intent. I nodded again and said impact mattered, which was why I had kept the documents factual, limited, and non-accusatory, and why I had not named anyone in that room as having committed a romantic betrayal, because romance was not a policy category, but conduct and abuse of authority were. Everett's throat tightened, because abuse of authority is a phrase that follows managers like a shadow. Evelyn asked for a brief recess so she could speak with Dana, which is what happens when the room realizes the story is no longer controllable through soft language. Everyone stood, and Lila moved toward Dana immediately, lowering her voice, and Adrian lingered near Everett as if seeking protection, which told me more about the power structure than any confession could have. I stayed seated for a moment, looking at the water bottle in front of me, listening to the hum of the building's ventilation, and feeling how strange it was that the institution now had to deal with the same thing I had been dealing with at home, documented reality refusing to bend. When I stood, I collected my sleeves calmly, not letting them keep anything I did not choose to submit, because ownership of the record was still mine. In the hallway, while they whispered behind the glass, I checked my phone and saw a company-wide all-hands invite for the next morning that had been sent while we were in the room, an agenda focused on culture, performance, and leadership updates. The timing was almost comical, because leadership loves to talk about values right when the floor under those values starts cracking. Then another message arrived, a short note from my manager asking me to attend early for a small role in supporting the meeting, which was vague enough to be either an opportunity or a setup. I saved both headers because now the arena was shifting from a closed room to a public one, and public is where people like Everett prefer to perform, which meant public was where they were most likely to make a mistake. When Evelyn called us back in, Dana's tone had changed again, and she announced that the case would move into a formal review process with documented submissions, and that all parties were expected to maintain professionalism and avoid retaliation. That language sounded neutral, but the important part was what she said next, because she acknowledged out loud that evidence had been received and would be reviewed under policy. It was a small sentence, but small sentences become large when they are spoken in official rooms. Lila's face tightened as she heard it, because she understood what I understood. Once evidence is officially received, it becomes harder to erase without leaving a stain. The meeting ended with no apology and no confession, which was fine, because I had not come for an apology. I walked out with my folder intact, my case number written on paper, and the institution now forced to carry a record it did not fully control. On the elevator down, I watched the floor numbers descend and felt the calm settle deeper, because tomorrow's all hands would be a stage built for men like Everett, and I had just been handed an invitation to be on that stage without asking for it. And as I stepped into the lobby and felt the cold air from the revolving doors hit my face, I realized the next 24 hours would decide whether this ended as a quiet HR file or as the kind of public correction Lila had laughed at when it was aimed at me. The all-hands began like every other corporate ritual, with smiles that were designed to look spontaneous and an agenda designed to feel inevitable. I arrived early because my manager had asked me to support the meeting setup, which gave me a lawful reason to be near the screen and the laptop without looking like I was seeking attention. The auditorium was not glamorous, just rows of chairs, a small stage, a lectern, and a projection wall that made ordinary words look official. People filed in carrying coffee and fatigue, and their conversations had that hollow brightness people use when they suspect something is wrong but still want to be employed. I watched Lila enter with Adrian close enough to be seen, and I watched Everett float behind them like a man who believed the room belonged to him. Dana sat near the front with Evelyn, both arranged to look neutral, and I felt my pulse slow into that familiar cold focus because this was the arena they had chosen, whether they admitted it or not. I did not carry a stack of paper into the room like a crusader, because that would have handed them a reason to label me disruptive. I carried one slim folder, the kind everyone carries, and I kept it tucked against my side like a boring accessory. The key was not volume, the key was timing, and they had already given me timing by scheduling this meeting immediately after the so-called resolution session. The company wanted to talk about culture before the culture could talk back, and that urgency told me everything I needed to know. When your leadership rushes to define the story, it is usually because someone else has proof. Everett opened with his usual tone of friendly authority, the tone that says he can joke about your marriage and still call it team building. He spoke about values, respect, and how the company supported healthy boundaries, and every word sounded rehearsed, polished, and lightly dishonest. The screen behind him displayed bullet points about trust and accountability, which would have been funny if it was not my life being used as a prop. I stood at the side with the AV laptop, eyes forward, posture relaxed, and I listened for the moment he would lean into his favorite trick, which was to imply that anyone resisting the narrative was unstable. He did not name me, but he did not have to, because the room already knew there was a problem, and the room was waiting for permission to decide what kind of problem it was. When he shifted to a slide about professionalism under stress, he glanced toward Dana, and the glance was subtle, but it was coordination, and coordination is what happens when people think they can steer outcomes with optics. That was the moment I acted, not with anger, not with a speech, but with a clean procedural interruption that looked like part of the meeting support. I stepped forward and asked Evelyn, quietly and with my head slightly lowered, whether the company intended to claim cultural accountability while an HR case involving leadership behavior was active. I did not raise my voice, and I did not accuse, and I did not say affair, because this was not romance, it was record. Evelyn's expression tightened, and she moved toward the aisle as if to handle it privately, which was exactly what they wanted, because private is where they negotiate you into silence. I did not allow private. I asked calmly whether the meeting minutes would reflect that evidence had already been received under an active case number. My words were plain enough that nearby employees heard them even if they pretended not to, and I watched heads tilt toward us in that collective way audiences do when a performance suddenly becomes real. Dana stood, walked toward the stage edge, and tried to guide me aside with a hand gesture that suggested cooperation, but cooperation is a trap when the other side controls the pen. I said politely that I was not asking for discussion, only for accurate record language, and I offered my folder to Evelyn as a documented submission for the minutes. The folder held a one-page timeline of dates, places, and payments with source labels that were household level and lawful. Evelyn opened the folder, and her eyes moved across the page quickly because she already knew what it was, and she knew what it would do to the room if it became visible. Everett's voice faltered at the lectern, and he attempted to regain rhythm by continuing his talking points, but the room's attention had shifted away from him because attention follows tension, and tension follows truth. Adrian stepped closer to Lila, and Lila's face went pale under her practiced makeup, because they both understood that the worst thing in a public room is a calm man holding a document. A calm man does not look like a threat until the institution has to explain why it is afraid of him. Dana leaned in and spoke to Evelyn in a low tone, trying to contain the moment, and Evelyn hesitated because facilitators hate choosing between process and optics. I made the choice for her without being theatrical. I asked her to log, on record, that evidence had been received and that the active review involved leadership conduct, not merely interpersonal conflict. I did not demand punishment, and I did not ask the audience to judge anyone's morality, and I did not look at Lila like a betrayed husband begging for sympathy. I looked at the process like a man refusing to be rewritten. Evelyn turned to the laptop connected to the projector, and she did the safest thing she could do in that instant, which was make the truth official without adding emotion. She pulled up a blank minutes template, projected it briefly under the guise of switching slides, and typed a single line that changed the entire room. She noted that evidence had been received under the active case number, and that the company would proceed with a formal review regarding leadership behavior and workplace boundaries. The words were dry and procedural, which made them lethal, because dry words cannot be dismissed as drama. The room went silent in that thick way that feels physical, and Everett's face tightened as he realized his stage had become a record. Everett attempted to speak again, but the sound came out smaller, and he tried to pivot into a reassurance about confidentiality and appropriate channels. I did not argue. I simply asked, in the same calm tone, whether he wished to retract his public comment that I did not deserve my wife, since it had initiated the boundary collapse in a workplace setting. He hesitated, and hesitation is a confession when the room is watching. He offered a vague apology aimed at the idea of offense rather than the act itself, and the room's silence did not reward him, because people can forgive many things, but they rarely forgive a leader who looks weak in public. Dana stepped forward and announced in corporate language that the meeting would continue under revised facilitation and that leadership and involved parties would be removed from direct supervision decisions pending review. She did not say demotion, but everyone understood the meaning. She stated that retaliatory behavior would be treated as misconduct, and she said it while looking directly at Everett, which told the room who the institution needed to control. Evelyn asked Everett to step down from the lectern, not aggressively, just procedurally, and he complied with the stiff posture of a man swallowing humiliation. Adrian tried to speak, then stopped, because speaking would have placed his voice into the record, and Lila sat rigid, eyes forward, as if she could stare through the moment without being touched by it. I did not celebrate. I collected my folder back from Evelyn after she confirmed receipt, and I stepped away from the stage like a man finishing a task, because the most satisfying justice is the kind that looks inevitable. As the meeting ended, I watched employees stand slowly, whispering in careful tones, not about my emotions, but about the fact that minutes had been typed live and leadership had been corrected in front of witnesses. Lila did not look at me, and Adrian did not smile anymore, and Everett's charm had drained from his face like color leaving a bruise. I walked out into the corridor with my posture unchanged, hearing the building behind me shift into a new shape, one where the story could no longer be laughed into existence. At the elevator, Dana approached with Evelyn, both wearing the controlled expressions of people managing damage. Dana informed me that the formal review would proceed immediately, that supervision chains would be altered, and that written findings would be issued under policy within the required time frame. She did not ask me to forgive, and she did not ask me to stay quiet, because the record now lived inside the institution and could not be unmade without making the company look corrupt. I nodded once, thanked her for confirming receipt on record, and stepped into the elevator as the doors began to close, leaving them standing in the hallway with the consequences they had tried to contain.